War, power, and hydroelectricity.
Well, one of the effects was that there'd been very little new development in Canada in terms of hydroelectricity for about a decade when the war hit.
An interview with Matthew Evenden about his new book on the mobilization of hydroelectric power in Canada during the Second World War. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 52 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. What fuels war? The total war of the Second World War placed enormous demands on the resources and the environment of Canada. Manufacturing equipment for the war and harvesting natural resources for production were some of the most substantial contributions Canadians made to the war effort on the home front. And most of the electricity that powered that effort came from falling water. As Matthew Evenden writes in his new book, Allied Power, Mobilizing Hydroelectricity During Canada's Second World War, Canada's war economy was mobilized on the banks of rivers as well as people. During the course of the Second World War, the federal government, the provinces, and private corporations coordinated in the expansion of Canada's hydroelectric capacity. By the end of the war, Canada was a hydroelectricity superpower. To learn more about the role of energy and environment in Canada's Second World War, I spoke with Matthew about his new book.
My name is Matthew Evenden, and I am an associate professor of geography at the University of British Columbia and also the associate dean of research and graduate studies in the Faculty of Arts.
Well, thanks for joining us, Matthew. We're talking about your most recent book, Allied Power, Mobilizing Hydroelectricity During Canada's Second World War, published by the University of Toronto Press. I thought I'd just start with the cover. It is, as you describe it in the book, an arresting image for audio listeners. This is great radio. It's a hand with water cascading between the fingers with some hydroelectric towers in the lower right-hand corner of the image. I thought maybe if you could start by telling listeners a little bit about where this image came from and why you selected it to discuss and include in this book.
Sure. I mean, this may be one of those cases where I wouldn't mind if people judged the book by its cover, because the image is really striking. It was produced by Marion Dale Scott, who was a very important modernist artist in Montreal in the interwar period, in the post-war period too. And she had taken a pretty strong stand in the early part of the war, refusing to take up any commissions for war art or propaganda pieces. And so it's a bit of an anomaly that she did in the end agree for the Wartime Information Board to prepare artwork for a poster which was promoting the major contributions of hydroelectric power to the wartime cause. And this was part of a series of images that were produced. Many wartime pieces of propaganda art use the device of a hand to signal strength or determination. What is interesting about this image, apart from the background that Marion Dale Scott had pacifist inclinations and was a strong feminist and produced an image with a strikingly masculine hand in it, something which provoked a response from her colleague Peggy Nichol, a feminist artist, to evince surprise at her choice of the subject matter. But what's interesting about it too is that if you look hard at the image, it's unlike some of those other propaganda art pieces where the hand really does signal strength or determination, because the river surging around and through the hand isn't ultimately captured by the hand. So it's possible, I think, to read this image in another way and to ask whether or not we can also identify here a subtle critique of the war and the inability of humans to control the rest of nature, to seize its power. So although on the surface it certainly promotes that message, it contains the grounds, I think, for questioning whether or not there isn't a critique embedded in this message too.
It's a fascinating image. I had seen it before. I'd come across it before in an exercise reviewing propaganda posters in Canada during the Second World War, but I had no idea about the background and the oddity of this pacifist producing one of the most striking propaganda images in terms of Canada's promotion of its natural resources, which is where the poster comes from. It focuses on Canada's development of hydroelectric power as a contribution to the war effort, which of course is the subject of this book. So in 1939, when the war broke out, what was the landscape of hydroelectric power generation like in Canada, or electric power generation in general?
Well, it was uneven. In central Canada, there was significant hydroelectric development. Much of this had been developed in the 1920s with a limited expansion in the 1930s, mainly in Quebec. But Quebec and Ontario together accounted for, a little over 2/3 of the total hydroelectric power generation in all of Canada. In the rest of the country, Manitoba and British Columbia were significant hydropower producers. Alberta somewhat less so, but almost no hydropower was produced in Saskatchewan, and only a modest amount in the maritime provinces in the north. So if you think about it in landscape terms, there was a kind of giant mountain in central Canada where the region from Lake Ontario stretching down the St. Lawrence was one of the most intensively developed hydro regions in the world, let alone Canada or North America. And then a few pockets of intensive hydro development in Western Canada. So there was a significant base of hydroelectric power in Canada, which was going to be important for the war, but it was regionally concentrated.
And what does this say about energy consumption or electricity consumption in Canada going into the war? It seems to me the experience of electricity across the country would be quite different.
I think that's absolutely right. And even when we lumped together Quebec and Ontario and central Canada as having a commonly developed hydroelectric infrastructure, in fact, they were quite different in terms of the pattern of use and interconnection and consumption. In Quebec, most of the hydropower was geared towards large industry. So the consumer use of electricity was pretty modest outside of cities like Montreal or Trois-Rivières. In Ontario, because of strong public policy objectives to expand the electrified universe in the early 20th century under the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario. Because of that, there was a different pattern of consumption, more rural electrification, more domestic use of electricity than in any part of Canada. But certainly the contrast with Quebec was striking. So what people used electricity for varied between regions. The electricity that was available for large industry varied between regions.
And you've alluded to this a little bit, but in the decade immediately prior to the outbreak of the war, the country had gone into an economic slump during the Great Depression. What effect did this have on the context of hydropower generation and consumption going into the war?
Well, one of the effects was that there'd been very little new development in Canada in terms of hydroelectricity for about a decade when the war hit. Mm-hmm. The big surge in hydro development before that is during the 1920s. So many of these big projects came to completion at the end of the 20s. There were plans for other projects. And then, as you say, the stock market crash, the wider effects of the politics of the Depression meant that in many regional markets, the demand for electricity fell way off. And as a result, private utilities, public utilities became risk averse and quite conservative in terms of future planning. They wanted to just sell the electricity they were already producing, let alone planning for massive boosts in consumption. That was almost unimaginable in the midst of the 1930s depression. So that's beginning to change by the end of the 30s in some local markets, particularly in some parts of Quebec. But at the outbreak of the war, the immediate background was limited to no development across the country for a decade. So using an older infrastructure with limits and utilities trying to build demand to use the electricity they were already producing. Right? So the margins were going to be very thin in 1939 for taking on any new large blocks of electricity demand, which of course would happen at the beginning of the war. So Canada was not in a great place for meeting the immediate and soaring demands of wartime, and that produced all kinds of political and economic pressures.
And did this prior experience during the Depression shape some of the wartime planning? Were private utilities or even the public utility in Ontario hesitant about expanding during the war?
There's no question, particularly in the early part of the war, utilities were, wondering who would pick up the cost if they massively expanded and found themselves with excess capacity at the end of the war. Alcan, the aluminum producer in Quebec, which was also a major hydroelectric producer for their smelting activities, was in this position and felt concerned that if they increased their capacity at the end of the war, they'd be left with a much greater supply of hydropower than they could possibly use. That turned out to be not the case, but in all the dealings they had with the Canadian government, with foreign governments, they tried to build in language in their contracts to protect themselves against that eventuality.
It's something that I think from a contemporary perspective is somewhat surprising or was unexpected when I read the book, that there would ever have been a period where electricity consumption had gone into decline, that expansion wasn't always the assumed position for an energy policy in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think we shouldn't say necessarily that it had declined so much as there was a fallback of a period of years, and utilities were concerned to bring up the demand as close to as they could to the available generation capacity, because at that point they were making a good profit. But taking big risks, building infrastructure with no apparent demand, that seemed like a crazy strategy. I mean, if you look at the contemporary United States in the 30s, that's in a way what the federal administration was doing under Roosevelt in building large projects in the Tennessee Valley and in the Columbia Valley. And no one was quite sure what industries would necessarily take up all this new electricity that was going to become available. And in a sense, the Second World War was an accidental and major producer of new demand that made these projects very useful and immediately utilized. But that wasn't because of planning.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction, I guess, between Canada and the United States during the Great Depression in terms of policy responses to the Depression, the sort of lack of large federal public works projects for hydroelectricity in Canada versus the United States.
It's a basic and important contrast. So whereas the U.S. was building capacity through the 30s, particularly after the mid-30s, in Canada, not only was there a limited engagement in these issues by the federal government, which incidentally didn't really have jurisdiction for pursuing large hydro projects, but provincial governments were equally concerned not to jump in and spend public money on these major works initiatives, at least in terms of hydro. The government in Ontario in the 30s was very strong in this regard, blocking any proposals for, say, a major initiative like the St. Lawrence Seaway in these years, because of the perception that this would be all, unnecessary, costly electricity that wouldn't be used.
And I guess this becomes important during the war, but what option did the government of Ontario take in terms of meeting its electricity demands rather than developing new hydroelectric facilities?
Yeah, well, the public system in Ontario, and this precedes the 30s, grew in part by signing contracts with private hydroelectric firms in Quebec. So there were major import contracts with Quebec firms. And this was controversial in Ontario, to be sure. And at various stages, the government of Ontario tried to cancel these contracts, rescale them, ship some of the power south to the United States. In each instance, failing in its broader objectives, but in the meantime doing nothing to increase its own generating capacity in the province of Ontario. So the issue of contracts and electricity imports is complicated, to be sure, but it meant basically a decade of delay in the case of Ontario, so that when the war hit, issues of new generation were particularly serious in Ontario.
So by September 1939, the war breaks out, and the federal government assumes its emergency powers. What measures did it take then to address electricity demand, needs for wartime production, and purposes, and how did it go about mobilizing hydroelectricity?
Well, initially there was a slow engagement of economic planning and particularly in respect to energy issues. It was really after the fall of France that the seriousness of the situation and the major responsibility falling on Canada within the wider Allied cause came home. Mm-hmm. And it was in 1940 that Department of Munitions and Supply was established, and different what were called economic controls were placed on different commodities or economic sectors. So, for example, there was a controller of timber, a controller of steel, a controller of oil, and importantly, a controller of electricity. Mm-hmm. And this was a new role for the federal government because it had not taken on this kind of broader national regulatory role previously. Jurisdiction over rivers and electricity was split, but it mainly fell within the provincial sphere. And so it was a brand new adventure for the Federal Wartime Administration to try and figure out, look, how do we mobilize the Canadian economy and provide it with the energy necessary to build war products, to ship commodities to allies and so forth. I mean, the electricity supply in Canada in 1939 depended almost wholly on hydroelectricity. 98% of Canada's electricity came from hydro sources. There were regionally important sites of coal burning and thermal production, particularly in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan and the Maritime provinces, but the bulk of electricity generation came from hydro. So the government really, in identifying a need for electricity control, was really circling hydroelectric control. And within that, giving a particular regional emphasis to central Canada and some parts of the West where that intervention could matter.
So this is where Herbert Symington comes into the picture then.
That's right. So Herbert Symington was appointed as the power controller. So that person in charge of electricity from its development to its consumption, who could intervene to reset prices if necessary, to compel private corporations to do things like build a dam and so forth. He was a lawyer in Montreal, the in-house counsel for Royal Securities. But he had wide national experience. He, grown up in Ontario, schooled in Ontario, went to law school at Osgoode Hall, and then set up his practice in Winnipeg earlier in the century, and became a very important corporate lawyer in Winnipeg, and then was recruited to Montreal later after having developed his national reputation. And he was someone who had expertise in transportation issues and river development issues and utilities, and particularly given his role with Royal Securities, which invested and guided investors in the field of timber companies, pulp and paper, and a lot of utilities and power companies. He knew many of the kind of regulatory issues that were involved. He was also a close friend of C.D. Howe, a business associate from before Howe's entrance into politics. So there were strong grounds there for a good connection, and Howe trusted Symington and thought he could succeed in his role.
Now, I had expected to encounter more instances of friction, I guess, between the provinces and the federal power controller, because here is the federal government to some degree assuming constitutional responsibilities of the provinces during a time of war. But did you find much conflict between Symington and the provinces?
Not much. I mean, he was skillful and diplomatic in dealing with the provinces. He knew he could potentially be stepping on provincial toes at any turn. Mm-hmm. I think that possibility was reduced somewhat given the scope of his responsibility. So he was not handed the power to set up a bunch of crown corporations to develop hydropower. That might have set
Yeah.
off fireworks in the provinces. Um, and he determined, given that he didn't have a staff really to help him regulate this field, that he would really need to engage provincial officials in Quebec and Ontario to essentially support him, supplying intelligence, and to help him regulate the field.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very much a kind of cooperative federalism that he was modeling. He did have conflicts, nevertheless, with particularly the government of Ontario, and he butted heads before the war with Premier Hepburn, who he had low opinion of, and Hepburn in turn saw Symington as a kind of representative of what he called the wolves of Montreal at one point in the late 30s. Symington also had conflict at the end of the war with the government of British Columbia and BC Electric because of his perception that there had been real stalling in the province to get ahead and build new and needed infrastructure, and he was irritated. But these were the kind of small dust-ups that you'd come across in their correspondence. But from a public point of view, these kinds of conflicts were beneath the surface.
Now, I guess I wondered if the federal role in terms of power control and even the oil control during the war ends up serving as a precursor or informs subsequent federal national energy policies in the years after the war.
I think there is definitely a post-war legacy to these activities. But I think rather than necessarily informing immediate post-war federal national policies, at least with respect to hydro, it's more that what happened in the war was a modeling of what could happen if governments intervened and helped to shape the development path in the hydroelectric field. So that by the end of the war, as the control powers were being relaxed and as some of the federal interventions in the wartime economy were being relaxed, the provincial governments began to assume new authorities than had been the case from before the war. Certainly, in the province of Ontario, this had already been established. It was a Hydroelectric Power Commission. But Hydro-Quebec was founded in 1944, a long-term populist program in Quebec to assume ownership of the Montreal Light Heat and Power Company. But nevertheless, it happens in the war. It happens after certain changes have occurred in the provincial economy. In different jurisdictions across the country, different governments begin to try and assume new powers, new authorities. In British Columbia, a power commission is established after the war, after a contentious debate as to whether or not the province or a collaborative of municipal governments should take over the monopoly power firm in Vancouver and Victoria, the BC Electric. So there are tensions around the kind of collective role of citizens, the role of the state at the end of the war, which I think cannot be disconnected from what has been rehearsed and demonstrated during the war around the possibilities of state intervention.
Now, the federal government in Canada obviously played a role in shaping hydropower, but it seemed that the diplomatic relationship between Canada and the United States was quite significant in terms of the projects that were pursued during the war. How important was the U.S. in terms of influencing Canadian power policy?
Yeah, the U.S. was hugely important in influencing power policy. That's not immediately evident at the beginning of the war, but it was diplomatic negotiations were still occurring at the very beginning of the war as the province of Ontario began to realize that they needed to develop more hydro within provincial boundaries, and for that to occur on an international river like the St. Lawrence, and then issues of allowable water taking, say, from Niagara were going to be involved. Diplomatic discussions had to be undertaken to figure out how that was going to work. And a new St. Lawrence Agreement was drawn up, which then provided the basic framework for the St. Lawrence Seaway development in the 50s, which would follow.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a major piece of it. Another major piece was around U.S. demand for aluminum. Aluminum is a highly energy-intensive production model, and Canadian production was well established and moving forward when the United States realized in 1940, 1941 that it was going to not be able to meet its aircraft production targets with domestic aluminum supplies. So major contracts were signed with Alcan. This had an impact on the scale of development of hydro development in eastern Quebec. It impacted other discussions because the United States wanted to know whether Canada would, as a result, meet other American demands around electricity export. So Canada continued to meet energy needs at Messina, New York, where Alcoa produced aluminum, even at times of major electricity shortage in Canada. And for any kind of boundary river issues came up. And an example of that is in British Columbia, where the West Kootenay Power and Light Company wanted to increase its hydro production on the Kootenay River to supply chemical and chemical production and mineral smelting at Trail, British Columbia, and required the permission of the United States and hearings through the International Joint Commission, a body established to look after binational issues on water on lakes and rivers that cross the Canada-U.S. boundary. So it came up at so many different points, the Canada-U.S. relationship. But the big picture is that after the entrance of the United States into the war, the close wartime alliance that Canada experienced with the United States also had all kinds of ramifications in terms of the economy, and with that, hydroelectric development.
It's a really interesting addition to the story of Canada's relationship with the United States during the Second World War to think about the geographic component of the degree to which the two countries were connected by flows of water and the ability to harness energy from water that, to some extent, set the framework for a diplomatic relationship throughout the war.
Yeah, no, it was woven into all the economic agreements and plans. I mean, the Hyde Park Declaration famously tied together the Canadian U.S. economies during the war. One little recognized element of that declaration was that there was aluminum specifically highlighted in the agreement that was inserted by the United States to ensure that they had sufficient supplies. So if you think about aluminum as frozen kilowatts, as some suggested it should be thought of in the war, it's really a discussion not just about aluminum and a metal, but it was about available hydropower.
So that's the next question I want to ask is about aluminum. And in a sense, this is, I think common in environmental histories of war to sort of follow the war material down its commodity chain from aircraft, which play a much more significant role in the Second World War than in the First World War, the lightweight metal required to manufacture it in the high volumes of hydroelectric power to create it. Was the power policy in Canada an aluminum policy?
I think you could argue that, and it certainly was through the middle years of the war in central Canada. And by that I mean that aluminum held priority. So if there was a shortage at any point, power had to be diverted first to the Saguenay Valley, where most of Canadian aluminum was being smelted. The developments which were going on in Quebec were all to support aluminum production. Various measures were being imposed in terms of conservation. In 1942, for example, to try and tide over Alcan in terms of getting the electricity that it needed and dampening down commercial and urban demand in all the interconnected markets of Quebec and Ontario. This isn't to say that there weren't other important wartime demands. Of course, other kinds of factories and commodities were being produced, many of them highly energy intensive. Also, domestic demand continued to grow through the war. All the kinds of electricity needs arising from urban transportation, streetcars and so forth, all of it was growing during the war as the economy rebounded and grew from the Depression. But I think aluminum was such a priority issue for the federal government to meet its commitments to the Allies that it had a centrally important part in the power policy. You have to remember how significant aluminum was and how significant Canada's position was in the supply of aluminum. Britain had smelters for aluminum in Scotland, but most of its aluminum had been imported before the war from Norway and France. Well, after the fall of France, after the fall of Norway, that stops. And so the British government had anticipated this potential problem, and it signed supply contracts with Alcan right at the beginning of the war. So Alcan became essentially the primary supplier of aluminum for the British and the British Commonwealth more generally. It supplies over 90% of aluminum. So if you think about the Blitz, if you think about the air war, from a British and Allied perspective, Canada made a huge contribution in terms of the materials required to carry out those missions and those battles. And Canada, as I said earlier, was also supplying aluminum to the United States in major quantities. So this key dimension of Canada's economic contribution was strongly tied to its hydro policy and hydro projects during the war.
This is an interesting way that this book gets you to think about Canada's role in the Second World War differently. I think in most narratives of Canada in the Second World War, the contribution that Canada is cited to have made to the Commonwealth is the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. But of course, the hydroelectricity and the aluminum production arguably plays an even more significant role in terms of the Allied air war. So it seemed to me over the course of this book, which spans a national history here, that there's tremendous regional variation in terms of experience of the power policy, the federal power policy across the country. Residents of southern Ontario would have been subject to conservation measures to reduce their electricity conservation, as well as Quebec. But on the coasts, there would have been blackouts to avoid bombing for security purposes. But then in Winnipeg, you show that there were neither of these measures. So Winnipeg was the bright light in the center of Canada during the Second World War. How important is geography to understanding Canada's national experience in the Second World War from the perspective of hydroelectricity?
Well, geography is a central dimension of this. I mean, you can think about geography in many different ways here, spatially in terms of the environmental background. In terms of the physical geography, of course, the Canadian Shield was the principal site of hydro development in central Canada. Mountainous terrains in the west were important. You can't really build successful hydro projects on sandy ground or in prairie landscapes. So the physical background, of course, was crucial. But added to that is all the technology and economic infrastructure that's developed in those kinds of contexts. And in central Canada, for a variety of reasons, there was a much more advanced development of interconnection systems, of transmission networks, so that Quebec and Ontario were in so many ways trading power back and forth and linking different utilities and regional systems together, so that when conservation measures were introduced, chiefly to try and dampen demand in southern Ontario, they had to be applied to both provinces where all large central systems were connected, both for political reasons, because people had to have a sense that they weren't being singled out necessarily, and that both provinces were carrying the burden of this, but also because they were interconnected. And so reducing demand in one section of southern Ontario would have positive effects on parts of interconnected regions in eastern Ontario, which were in turn connected to regions in Quebec through supply contracts and so on. So the geographical context of technology was critical here too. Geography also plays a role, of course, in the urban-rural divide in Canada during the war with respect to electricity. I mean, rural electrification was not well developed outside of Ontario. I mean, in Alberta during the war, something like 5% of rural households had electricity. So electricity was a much more urban phenomenon than we would certainly imagine today. And so there was a strong rural-urban dimension to the experience and use of electricity at this time.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I guess when you sort of light up Canada by hydroelectricity, you see a very different kind of country, one that is quite disjointed from place to place. Even in British Columbia, where there is some industrial capacity during the war, the interconnections are just physically unfeasible between the Kootenays and the Lower Mainland.
Yeah, I mean, in BC, there were two major regions where electricity was available and hydro powering it. One at the coast in Vancouver, and most of that was supplied by relatively small dams in the regional hinterland. And then another major hub in the south east of the province in the Kootenay Valley, where Cominco and allied with it, the West Kootenay Power and Light Company, had developed significant hydro since the late 19th century. But what separates those two hubs, of course, are several mountain ranges and major and difficult distances to transcend. So the first strategies employed in any of these kind of limited, geographically circumscribed hydro contexts was to kind of intensify the development opportunities at hand. But there wasn't a strategy pursued to build major transmission infrastructure, as had happened in Quebec and Ontario, and to a lesser extent in Alberta, where the construction costs were much lower. In BC, that wasn't really a practical option. At the end of the war, the Vancouver region was tied into increased power supplies coming from the United States, from the Bonner Power Administration. And that really saved Vancouver from an ugly period of very uncertain power supply. But other options were not feasible.
And I guess in the Alberta context, you have a good regional case study there. You go to some extent to try and answer this question, I think, in the book, but was it necessary to turn Lake Minnewanka into a hydroelectric reservoir?
Yeah, so the Alberta case is interesting. Calgary was supplied almost purely by hydroelectric power, but most of the rest of the province depended on coal burning in thermal plants. And when the war hit, a major explosives or a chemical plant which was geared towards supplying nitrate for explosives production was sited near Calgary. And part of that decision to site it there was that there was land available, housing available for workers, natural gas from the Turner Valley was at hand, railroad links, water from the Bow River. In terms of the production facility, everything was set. What wasn't set was electricity supply, and this was going to be an energy-intensive plant. And so the local utility, Calgary Power, used the war as a lever to pursue an objective it had had for over a decade, which was to dam Lake Minnewanka, which is located right at the center of Banff National Park. And this, of course, was a political hot potato. It had been, this objective had been strongly rejected in the previous decades, and in part, the federal parks legislation had been rewritten to bar large industrial development projects such as this one from going forward. But Calgary Power managed to make the argument, and C.D. Howe in Ottawa certainly carried that argument within the federal war cabinet, that this was a wartime necessity and the dam had to be built and there were no other quick options. There were other options, but they would take a couple of years, or there were difficulties supplying some of the turbine technology for thermal plants, et cetera, et cetera. There were a long list of excuses. So the opposition folded. Reticence expressed by Prime Minister Mackenzie King, other federal cabinet members went by the wayside, and the dam went forward. The strange thing was that once this power was supplied, the need for this nitrate production from the plant near Calgary was effectively ruled out. Part of the reason why there was so much nitrate production cited in Canada at the beginning of the war was that the British were fairly certain that the Germans would bomb their nitrate producing facilities in the UK. So this was a way to kind of backstop that production program. That didn't happen to the extent that was anticipated. So Canada's production was really just being added to that. And then the US entered the war, and there was massive additional nitrate supply. So what happened at the end of the war was a need to, unless they were going to shut this plant down, a need to figure out what they could use this nitrate for otherwise. And so, for the most part, this plant that was planned for supplying explosives came to be a fertilizer production plant, right? So the nitrate was converted into commercial fertilizers, and the Canadian government subsidized fertilizer introduction into Canadian agriculture, arising from sources like this one in Calgary. So you could say that the dam was built really to supply fertilizer production by the end of the war. I mean, the Calgary system also supplied electricity to other regions of Alberta that experienced shortages at the end of the war, particularly arising from shortages of coal, which came about because of labor strife in the coal mining sector. So that power delivered its results, but not according to the script that was written at the beginning of the war.
So in each of the chapters, you move across the country, and we see all of these quite variable experiences of hydroelectric power policy and change during the course of the war. Why construct this as a national history? Why not focus just on central Canada, for example? What led you to write a history of Canada rather than just Ontario and Quebec?
Well, I guess the simple answer to that would be that I didn't think I could really understand any of the regional stories alone. They were all in one way or another connected. And I mean, I'd first come across this federal power policy in the war when I was doing work in British Columbia, and it seemed strange and interventionist and completely out of the ordinary of what happened in the peacetime. And then I did work with Chris Armstrong and Viv Nellis in Alberta, where I came across the story about Lake Minnewanka in a preliminary way. And it just seemed to me I wondered what on earth was going on at the federal level, that the government would be getting involved in all these different hydro projects. And given that central Canada was so much more important in terms of total hydro production, I thought there was probably an important story to tell there. So although I try and bridge the gap between the national story and the regional or provincial story, I think it's basically impossible to understand one without the other. So the national story can't be written as a national story because there's too much internal variation across the country. But equally, you can't tell the story of one region and assume it has some explanatory power for the country as a whole. It was a very mixed picture.
So I've got a couple of historiographical questions to wrap up here. The first is about the environmental history of war, which is a growing body of scholarship. And here we have a case study in Canada. So what does your study here of hydroelectricity add to that literature on the environmental history of war?
Well, I think the important historiography on this topic of war and environment that's come out of the last 20 years now has, in an initial phase, focused at the battlefront and important questions about what is the environmental impact of warfare. What happens when different warfare technologies are unleashed on landscapes and human bodies? Those are all important, necessary questions to ask. But I guess looking at that set of international questions, I was concerned to understand how Canada fit in to the war-environment relationship. It was obvious that Canada contributed to the war, so how did the war affect Canada? And in looking at the Canadian context, we get a better sense of how World War impacted diverse sites and places at a distance from the front of battle. So there are backward linkages that warfare produces, and those backward linkages can produce really unintended, strange outcomes at a distance. I mean, you can give as examples of this the unintended consequences of the reduction of North Atlantic fishing during the war because of the threat of U-boat attacks in the North Atlantic. Well, this had a measurable effect on cod stocks during the war that had, of course, then an impact on the intensity of the post-war fishery because of the lack of fishing during the war years. It had an impact in other distant landscapes. I mean, I think the example I've addressed earlier in an essay on aluminum commodity change concludes with an image of the remains of American fighter aircraft in Papua New Guinea. And a lot of this material was just kind of left because it was too expensive to remove. Judy Bennett's book on war and environment in the South Pacific addresses that question more generally. But there were all kinds of environments and landscapes transformed during the war because of wartime needs, because of wartime mobilization that we need to understand, both in terms of the immediate wartime context, but the frames, the legacies of the war moving forward as well.
I tried to tally some of those up in my mind at the end of the book. In terms of hydropower policy, what were the longest lasting ecological effects? Was it the Shipshaw project? Is it flooding wildlife habitat? Or is it the fertilizer?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think this may be another contribution to the historiography, insofar as my argument is that hydro projects, individual hydro projects, of course, had specific environmental impacts, but there was nothing particularly unusual about those impacts during the war compared to pre or post-war projects. So it's nothing about the war itself that produces a new ecology. Some have argued that there ought to be thought of a specific wartime ecology. I don't think I'd agree with that. But what we do see is a ramping up of a kind of development model. And so while, yes, we could highlight some specific environmental legacies arising out of the war, I would suggest that it's the economic development that occurs during the war, the kind of redrawing of the boundaries of how state intervention occurred to build new projects, the whole assumption that dams were a model for development, that dams could integrate an economy and power it forward. I think those really gain momentum during the war. And questions about the impacts of dams on human communities or fisheries and so forth, that's really swept aside in a utilitarian discourse during the war. And it takes decades for challenges to that vision to really gain hold in Canada and indeed internationally. So I think there is a major impact on the models of development, the thinking around hydro and its place in society that transcends any specific environmental legacies of these wartime projects.
And the other area where I see this book adding is in terms of energy history. So in what ways do you see this case study of federal power policy shaping broader elements of Canada's energy history?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that has become obvious to me through the course of preparing this book is that Canada is an international weirdo insofar as electricity is concerned. Very few other countries internationally have relied historically so heavily on hydroelectricity. And to this day, Canada remains a major producer of hydropower and more reliant on hydropower, particularly in some provinces like Quebec or British Columbia, than is the case in other Western states, to be sure. So one of the contributions is to identify how central one particular energy carrier, hydroelectricity, was to the whole infrastructure of energy production and use in this country.
Well, the book is available now from University of Toronto Press. It's called Allied Power, Mobilizing Hydroelectricity During Canada's Second World War. Matthew, thanks so much for telling us more about this fascinating look into Canada during the war from a very different perspective. Nature's Past is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Matthew Evenden and me, Sean Courage. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes page at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast through iTunes and other podcast players, and leave comments. Please let us know what you think about the podcast by leaving comments or writing a short review on our iTunes page. You can also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast. And you can follow us on YouTube at youtube.com/naturespast. You can always find out more about environmental history research in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org, and you can find out more about the topics we discussed on this episode on our show notes page. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.